Thanksgiving at my parents' house always came with two guarantees: too much food and at least one reminder that, in my father's eyes, I would never measure up to my older brother. I had barely taken my second bite of turkey when Dad leaned back in his chair and glanced through the dining room window. He nodded toward my modest sedan parked at the curb. "So," he said loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, "still renting?" The conversation stopped. Every pair of eyes landed on me. Before I could answer, Dad chuckled and raised his glass toward my brother. "Daniel already owns 3 houses. 3. That's what happens when someone actually knows how to build a future." My mother smiled, without looking up from her plate. "And Flora," she said, 25 years old and still throwing money away on rent. Honestly, that's just pathetic." A few relatives exchanged uncomfortable smiles. Others laughed quietly, unsure whether they should. Daniel shrugged with a grin that suggested he'd heard this speech many times before. I simply folded my napkin and looked at my watch. Dad mistook my silence for embarrassment. "See," he continued, "nothing to say. Maybe instead of pretending everything's fine, you should ask your brother how real estate works. You might own one little house before you're 40. No one defended me. Not because they hated me. Because they believed him. My phone vibrated in my pocket. I glanced at the screen. "Work." I declined the call. Dad noticed. "Busy applying for another apartment," he joked. The table erupted into another round of laughter. Seconds later, my phone rang again. I excused myself quietly and answered. "Flora speaking." A calm voice replied immediately. "Ma'am, your motorcade has arrived. The legal team is assembled, and the acquisition documents are ready whenever you are." "I'll be outside in just a moment," I said before ending the call. When I looked up, everyone at the table was staring at me. Dad burst into laughter. "A motorcade," he repeated. "Who are you trying to impress now?" I didn't answer. I stood, adjusted my jacket, and walked toward the front hallway. Then the sound reached the house. Several black luxury SUVs turned slowly onto the quiet residential street. One after another. The engines idled outside my parents' home. Every relative hurried toward the living room windows. No one spoke. The lead vehicle stopped directly in front of the house. Before anyone could make sense of what they were seeing, the front doorbell rang. Dad remained frozen beside the window, one hand still wrapped around his glass. Outside, another black SUV eased to a stop behind the first. Then another. Daniel frowned. "What is this?" I slipped my phone back into my pocket. "If you'll excuse me, I need to take a quick work call." Dad stepped into the hallway before I could reach the door. "No," he said firmly. "We're finishing this conversation first." He folded his arms across his chest. "You don't get to dodge reality because some telemarketer called." The relatives laughed softly again. I looked at him for a moment. "I really do need to go." "It can wait." For most of my life, that had been his answer whenever it came to me. My goals could wait. My opinions could wait. Even my accomplishments could wait. Only Daniel's milestones deserved everyone's attention. Growing up, every family gathering sounded the same. Daniel bought another investment property. Daniel upgraded his car. Daniel got promoted. Whenever someone asked how I was doing, Dad usually answered before I had the chance. "Oh, Flora's still figuring things out." He'd smile as though he were apologizing for me. No one ever questioned it. I rarely talked about work. My company required frequent travel, confidential negotiations, and long stretches away from home. Missing birthdays and holidays became normal, and every absence only convinced my family that I was drifting from one failed opportunity to another. The less I explained, the more confident Dad became that he understood my life. Several months earlier, he had visited my apartment for the first time. He stood in the parking lot, looking at the building, and shook his head. A renter. He actually sounded disappointed. You'll never understand real estate if you can't even own one house. I remembered smiling to myself because the irony was almost impossible to ignore. I had spent that very morning reviewing the purchase of hundreds of apartment units across 3 cities. But I simply unlocked my apartment door and changed the subject. Arguing would not have changed his mind. Building something extraordinary eventually would. A movement outside pulled everyone back toward the windows. Several men and women in tailored suits stepped from the vehicles. One carried a leather portfolio. Another spoke quietly into an earpiece. 2 security officers scanned the street before opening the rear passenger door. Every step they took was toward my parents' front porch. Daniel swallowed. "They're coming here." No one answered. The first executive reached the front steps, straightened his jacket, and pressed the doorbell. Why would executives with security escorts be walking toward Richard Bennett's front porch? Before anyone inside could react, the doorbell rang a second time. Dad let out a short laugh. "Probably the neighbors," he muttered as he reached for the handle. The moment the door opened, a sharply dressed woman stepped forward with a professional smile. "Good afternoon," she said. "Is Ms. Flora Bennett available?" Dad frowned. "I think you've got the wrong address." The woman glanced at the tablet in her hand. "This is the correct address. We're looking for Ms. Flora Bennett." "My daughter?" Dad asked, almost amused. "No executive is looking for my daughter." Without changing her expression, the woman replied, "Yes, sir, Flora Bennett." The room fell silent. I stepped around Dad. "I'm Flora." Every member of the delegation straightened slightly. "Good afternoon, Ms. Bennett," the woman said respectfully. "Thank you for waiting. We apologize for interrupting your family gathering." I nodded. "No problem." An attorney immediately handed me a secured leather folder. "We've incorporated the final revisions from New York. Only your approval remains." I flipped through several pages. Any objections from the sellers? They accepted the revised valuation 20 minutes ago. Another executive stepped forward. "The acquisition meeting has been delayed until your arrival. Everyone is waiting for you." A member of the security detail checked his watch. "Ma'am, we've adjusted the helicopter departure because of highway congestion. You'll still arrive on schedule." Behind me, I could feel every relative staring through the open doorway. Daniel slowly walked closer. "Helicopter," he whispered. The attorney continued, as though no one else existed. "The commercial portfolio totals 43 properties. Financing has been fully confirmed." Daniel's eyes widened. 43 properties. Dad forced a laugh. "So, what is she? Some kind of assistant? Project coordinator?" No one answered him. Instead, the woman turned toward me. "Founder and Chief Executive Officer, would you like us to review the acquisition summary before departure?" The title hung in the air. Founder. Chief Executive Officer. The relatives exchanged bewildered glances. Even my mother lowered her coffee cup without taking a sip. Dad shook his head. "This doesn't make any sense." His confidence had begun to crack, but disbelief still held him together. The attorney carefully closed the folder before asking in a quiet, respectful voice, "Ma'am, would you like us to brief your family before we leave?" For a moment, no one moved. The attorney's question lingered in the silence. "Ma'am, would you like us to brief your family before we leave?" I shook my head. "That's not necessary." I accepted the folder and smiled politely. They've already had enough interruptions today. I turned toward the front steps, intending to leave the matter there. "Flora." Dad's voice stopped me. It wasn't loud. It wasn't mocking. It was uncertain. I slowly turned around. "What is all of this?" he asked. "Tell me what's going on." I hesitated. I really need to leave. No, he said, taking a step forward. Not until someone explains why people in suits are calling you Chief Executive Officer. The lead attorney glanced at me for permission. I gave a small nod. He faced my family. Mr. Bennett, your daughter is the founder and majority owner of Bennett Urban Capital. Dad frowned. I've never heard of it. The attorney wasn't offended. Many people haven't. The company is privately held. He opened the folder and removed a summary sheet. Today's acquisition cannot close without Ms. Bennett's personal authorization. She approved every stage of the negotiation. Another executive continued. The portfolio includes multiple commercial districts, office developments, mixed-use properties, and residential communities. Daniel stared at the documents. Oh, wait. He stepped closer. Bennett Urban Capital. He repeated the name quietly. I know that company. Everyone looked at him. He swallowed hard. They're the developers behind Riverside Quarter and Harbor Exchange. He looked at me as though seeing a stranger. I toured one of their projects last month. The attorney nodded. Those are two of Ms. Bennett's flagship developments. Dad forced another laugh. This has to be exaggerated. No, sir, the attorney replied calmly. Our valuation reports were updated this morning. One of the executives unlocked a secure tablet. She rotated the screen toward my family. At the top was my photograph. Beneath it appeared my title, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. Further down, one figure dominated the page. Estimated enterprise value, $3.1 billion. The room became completely silent. No one laughed. No one spoke. Even the children stopped whispering. My mother slowly lowered herself into a dining chair, as though her knees could no longer support her. Daniel kept staring at the screen. I've been applying to partner with this company for almost a year, he said quietly. He looked back at me. I never knew. The attorney closed the tablet. Several financial institutions, represented by Mr. Bennett, also work directly with Ms. Bennett's organization. Daniel's face lost its color. Everything Dad had praised him for suddenly connected to a company, led by the daughter he had dismissed for years. Dad looked at my modest car, parked beside the curb. Then at the convoy. Then back at me. His certainty had disappeared. I handed the signed acquisition documents back to the attorney. Let's go. The security team opened the rear passenger door. Just as I reached the vehicle, Dad called my name one more time. Flora. I stopped with one hand resting on the door and slowly turned back to face him. I looked at my father for several seconds before speaking. I never wanted this to happen like this. No one answered. The only sound came from the idling engines outside. Dad slowly walked toward me. $3.1 billion, he asked quietly. I nodded once. It's an estimated valuation. His shoulders sagged. When? When did all of this happen? I smiled gently. It didn't happen overnight. I looked around the room. After college, I joined a small commercial investment firm. While everyone else was chasing titles and expensive lifestyles, I spent years learning how to identify overlooked properties. The relatives listened without interrupting. I reinvested every bonus. I lived below my means. I took risks nobody could see. When opportunities came, I bought assets instead of appearances. I glanced toward the street. The apartment you laughed at was 5 minutes from my headquarters. The older car you hated was reliable. I rented because it made more sense than buying a house I barely had time to sleep in. I smiled faintly. I wasn't trying to look successful. I was trying to become successful. Dad lowered his head. For years, he had measured achievement by driveways, luxury cars, and neighborhood addresses. He had spent every Thanksgiving comparing Daniel's visible mortgages with the invisible business Flora had quietly built. The realization hit him harder than any argument ever could. Mom wiped tears from her eyes. "We never even asked what you actually did." "No," I replied softly. "You decided you already knew." Daniel walked toward me. "I owe you an apology." He looked genuinely ashamed. "I thought you avoided talking about work because you weren't doing well." He shook his head. "I've spent the last year trying to get meetings with Bennett Urban Capital." He laughed bitterly. "I had no idea I was trying to impress my own little sister." A few relatives quietly admitted they had joined the jokes simply because they assumed my parents were telling the truth. No one had ever questioned the family narrative. I wasn't angry, just disappointed. "I never needed everyone to admire me," I said. "I only hoped my own family would respect me enough to ask who I was before deciding who I wasn't." Dad's eyes filled with regret. "I'm sorry, Flora. I was wrong. I thought I was pushing you to do better." I met his eyes. "No. You were teaching me that nothing I accomplished would ever matter unless it matched your definition of success." He looked as though those words hurt more than discovering my company was worth billions. "I can't change the past," he whispered. "I know. But trust isn't rebuilt because someone discovers a bank account. It's rebuilt through consistent respect." He nodded slowly. For the first time in years, he didn't argue. He simply accepted the truth. Over the following months, things changed. Dad stopped introducing people by what they owned. Daniel began calling me for professional advice instead of giving it. Mom made an effort to know my life rather than assume it. Some relatives apologized individually for laughing that Thanksgiving afternoon. I accepted every sincere apology, but I never allowed wealth to become the foundation of those relationships. Business continued exactly as before. Our acquisition closed successfully that evening. The commercial district became one of the company's strongest investments. Months later, I finally bought my own home. Not because I needed to prove my father wrong. Not because anyone expected me to. I bought it because it fit the life I had built. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't watching people realize how wealthy you are. It's watching them realize how completely they misunderstood you. The last Thanksgiving we shared looked very different. Dad never asked who owned the biggest house. Instead, he asked everyone about their dreams. For the first time, the conversation wasn't about possessions. It was about people. And as I drove home that night, I realized something. The greatest thing I ever built wasn't a $3.1 billion real estate empire. It was a life that no longer depended on anyone else's approval.